You ever meet a man who could build a cathedral with his bare hands, but wouldn't dare suggest a design for a birdhouse? A man whose hands knew the whisper of wood, the strength of steel, the perfect line of a cut, but whose heart often just whispered doubt. He'd stand there looking at a finished piece, seeing only the almost invisible knot he had to work around, or the hairline gap that no one else would ever notice instead of the sturdy beauty he'd brought into the world. He was a man who carried a quiet weight not on his shoulders but deep in his gut, a burden he rarely spoke of, even to himself. That's a universal truth right there. We all got a version of that weight. That was Clayton, 42 years old, give or take a few hard winters. A carpenter, same as his old man before him and his granddad before that. His whole life smelled of sawdust, linseed oil, and the faint, sweet scent of newly cut pine. He wasn't a flashy guy. You wouldn't pick him out of a crowd. He looked exactly what he was, a working man. His face was a landscape of a life lived outdoors and in dusty workshops. Lines around his eyes from squinting at measurements under bright sun, a permanent faint tan on his neck where his shirt collar didn't quite reach. But it was his hands that told the real story. Calluses thick as old leather, knuckles a roadmap of old scars, a hammer slip here, a saw kiss there, a splinter that burrowed deeper than it should have. They were strong hands, capable hands, hands that could coax beauty from a raw plank or wrestle a stubborn beam into place. When he picked up a tool, it looked like an extension of himself, like they were born together. Yet those same hands often found themselves shoved deep into his pockets, especially when someone offered a compliment. He'd shift his weight, offer a curt nod, maybe mumble something about just doing the job. He wasn't much for talking, preferring to let his work speak for itself. Or rather, he hoped it would speak for him because he rarely spoke up himself. His eyes, though, they weren't angry or sad, not exactly. More like constantly appraising, always looking, dissecting. You could see the wheels turning behind them, the endless calculations, the quiet worrying. He saw the world in angles and measurements, in potential stresses and structural integrity. And he applied that same rigorous, often critical gaze to himself. There was a seriousness to him, a quiet hum of thought that never quite switched off, even when he was just sipping his coffee in the morning quiet. He appeared reliable, dependable, a rock. But beneath that solid surface, a different story was always playing out. He was a man holding onto a secret, a fear, that the rock might just crumble if he tried to build too high. Clayton's world started every morning with the same unyielding rasp of an alarm clock set for 5. Not a phone chime, mind you, but an old-school brass bell jangle that he'd set on the floor, just far enough away that he couldn't swat it without getting out of bed. Even then, he'd mostly just lean over and slam the snooze, buying himself 9 more minutes of a quiet dark that felt like a stolen treasure. His modest house, passed down from his folks, creaked with the chill of the morning, a familiar groan that was as much a part of the rhythm as his own quiet breathing. Sarah, his wife, would still be asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even. Lily, 10, and Ethan, 7, tucked into their own dreams down the hall. They were the reason for the alarm, the reason for the work, the reason for everything. He'd slip out, careful not to wake anyone, and make his way to the kitchen for coffee, black, strong, and a little too much of it. The pre-dawn quiet was his time, the only time it felt like the world wasn't asking something of him. He'd sit there, hands wrapped around a warm mug, the steam curling into the dim light, watching the first hint of gray smudge the sky outside his kitchen window. Then came the day. Hauling lumber, measuring twice, cutting once, nailing, sanding, painting. Another deck, another fence, a set of kitchen cabinets for a client who wanted something sturdy, nothing fancy. He was good at it, no doubt. His joints were tight, his lines clean, his finishes smooth. People complimented his work, said he was a craftsman. But it was always the same kind of work, the bread-and-butter jobs that kept the lights on and the kids in shoes. Reliable, conventional, safe. It paid the bills mostly. The electric bill always seemed a little heavier on the counter than it should, the gas bill a bit tighter. Every month was a delicate dance of balancing the books, making sure there was enough left over for Lily's art supplies or Ethan's new soccer ball. He'd underbid jobs more often than not, a subconscious habit, driven by a fear that if he asked for what he was truly worth, they'd just go with someone else. Better to get the work, any work, than none at all. But in the quiet moments, away from the sawdust and the drone of the saw, a different kind of hum existed inside Clayton, a constant, low thrum of doubt. It was the voice that whispered, "Are you really good enough?" every time he started a new project. It was the shadow that dimmed the pride in a finished piece, pointing out every tiny flaw, every almost perfect joint, every minor imperfection that no one else would ever notice. He was a carpenter, yes, But he was also an artist trapped in a cage of his own making. He'd catch himself staring at a beautifully gnarled piece of oak, imagining it as a flowing, sculpted console table, or sketching out intricate, custom designs for built-ins in the margins of his estimates. Designs that were unique, that challenged the grain, that spoke to a vision far beyond sturdy and functional. But those dreams stayed on the scraps of paper, crumpled and forgotten at the bottom of his toolbox. They were too risky, too much of a gamble. What if he tried and failed? What if he poured his heart into something and no one understood it, no one wanted it? The thought was a cold knot in his stomach. It wasn't just the fear of losing money or wasting time. It was the deeper, more insidious fear that if he truly tried to express the potential he knew deep down was there, and it wasn't met with resounding success, it would confirm his deepest fear, that he simply wasn't good enough. So he played it safe always. He was a competent carpenter, a reliable husband, a good father. But there was a growing, aching gap between the man everyone saw and the man he knew he could be, wanted to be. And that gap, that unfulfilled space, was starting to feel like a slow, quiet suffocation. That slow, quiet suffocation was Clayton's daily rhythm. His alarm clock, a cheap digital relic, blared at 5:00 a.m. every weekday, a sound he'd learned to dread long before it ever went off. The first light of dawn, still a hesitant gray behind the curtains, often found him already staring at the ceiling, the list of the day's tasks, and more importantly, the month's bills already unspooling in his head. He'd roll out of bed, the old springs groaning in protest, and feel the familiar ache in his lower back before his feet even hit the cold floor. The ritual was always the same. A quick splash of water on his face, the slow grind of coffee beans. He couldn't afford the fancy stuff, but he wasn't about to drink instant. And then the quiet clatter of him making his kids' lunches, usually peanut butter and jelly sandwiches cut into perfect triangles, alongside an apple. Sarah would be up a little later, getting herself ready for her shift at the community college front desk. But those early morning hours belonged to Clayton and the silent weight he carried. He'd eat his own breakfast standing up, usually just a piece of toast, and then head out, the scent of sawdust and coffee clinging to his worn work clothes. The drive to the job site was often the longest part of his day, not in miles, but in the internal monologue it spawned. Another deck, another fence, a set of basic kitchen cabinets built to spec, no flair, just solid utility. He was good at it, sure. His joints were tight, his cuts precise, his finishes smooth. He rarely had callbacks, but there was no joy in it, not anymore. Just the relentless hum of the saw, the repetitive swing of the hammer, the predictable geometry of straight lines and right angles. He was a craftsman doing assembly line work, a quiet symphony of potential muted by the monotonous beat of necessity. He'd often pass other shops, their signs advertising custom furniture, intricate wood-turning, unique installations. A pang, sharp and quick, would hit him. He knew he could do that. He knew his hands, given the chance, could bring beauty and originality to life. But then the familiar voice would whisper, "And what if you couldn't? What if you tried and they laughed? What if you lost the steady work you have now, chasing some fool's dream?" It was a cold splash of doubt that always extinguished the ember of ambition. The money was always tight. He'd underbid jobs more often than not, just to secure the work, terrified of being seen as too expensive, of losing out to a competitor. He'd shave margins so thin they were invisible, telling himself it was just good business, when deep down he knew it was fear. Fear of not providing. Fear of letting Sarah down, of telling Lily and Ethan they couldn't have that new school supply or go on that field trip. He'd watch his bank account like a hawk, meticulously subtracting every grocery bill, every utility payment, every mortgage installment, the numbers always teetering on the edge of comfortable, never quite landing there. He saw the quiet sacrifices Sarah made too, the way she made do with older clothes, the quick glance she'd give a new item in a store, then turn away without a word. He hated that he couldn't give them more, not just financially, but of himself, the vibrant, creative man he knew he could be. This internal struggle, this constant self-talk, was the true weight he carried, heavier than any timber beam. The crumpled sketches, those beautiful, wild designs he'd draw, weren't just forgotten at the bottom of his toolbox. They were buried in a deeper part of him. They were ghosts of possibilities, taunting him, reminding him of the distance between his calloused hands and his unfulfilled heart. He'd look at Lily's bright, curious eyes or Ethan's boundless energy and see fragments of his own forgotten youth, brimming with unbridled possibility. He wanted to tell them to chase their dreams, to believe in themselves, but how could he, when he couldn't even manage to do it for himself? The gap between the reliable, quiet carpenter everyone saw and the ambitious, creative artist he secretly yearned to be wasn't just aching, it was festering. It manifested as a constant low-grade anxiety, a tight knot in his stomach that never fully loosened. He'd find himself staring blankly at a finished piece, not with pride, but with a critical eye, dissecting every microscopic imperfection, telling himself it wasn't good enough, that he wasn't good enough. This wasn't healthy perfectionism. It was a self-inflicted wound, a quiet erosion of his own worth. The thought of stepping outside his comfort zone, of truly putting himself out there, felt like staring into an abyss. It was easier, safer, to remain in the shadows, to play it small, even if it meant living with the slow, quiet suffocation of an unlived life. It was a prison of his own making, a cage constructed from whispers of doubt and the constant fear of what might happen if he dared to truly fly. It was a prison of his own making, a cage constructed from whispers of doubt and the constant fear of what might happen if he dared to truly fly. And it stayed that way, day in and day out, until one Tuesday afternoon when the world decided to give him a swift kick to the teeth, right where it hurt most. He remembered it like it was yesterday, though years have since rolled by. The sun was low, painting the kitchen with tired gold when the back door creaked open. He was wiping down his workbench, sawdust still clinging to his hair and clothes. He heard the usual clatter of Lily's backpack hitting the floor, the murmur of Sarah asking about her day, but then silence. A heavy, quiet kind of silence that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Then a sniffle. He walked into the kitchen, his heart already tightening. Lily stood there, her usually bright face crumpled, tears carving clean paths through the dust of a long school day. In her hands, held like a broken bird, was the small, meticulously crafted birdhouse they'd spent a weekend on just last month. It was made from reclaimed cedar, tiny dovetail joints that only an experienced eye would notice, a perfectly pitched roof, and a little perch carved smooth as river stone. Helped her, sure, but he'd let her do most of the sanding, the painting of the little blue door. It was a fine piece, a truly lovely thing. Better than fine, honestly. It was exceptional. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice softer than usual and not forming in his stomach. Lily just shook her head, unable to speak, her lower lip trembling. Sarah knelt beside her, pulling her clothes. "She lost the competition, Clay," Sarah whispered, her eyes meeting his, full of sympathy. "The birdhouse competition." Clayton frowned. "Lost." He looked at the birdhouse again. No way. He'd seen the entries last year at the school fair. Lily S. was miles ahead. "Who won?" he asked, trying to keep the edge out of his voice. Lily finally choked out the words, her voice small and raw. "Jessica. Her dad just glued some sticks together. It wasn't even straight, Daddy. It was ugly." And then she looked up at him, her 10-year-old eyes wide and brimming with a pain that ripped through him like a dull blade. "Daddy," she sobbed, the words shattering his world into 1,000 pieces. "Why does our best never seem good enough?" That question, it hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Why does our best never seem good enough? It wasn't just a child's heartbroken wail about a school project. It was his own damn voice echoing in her innocent plea. It was every underbid job, every shelved design, every time he'd talked himself out of reaching for something bigger, something bolder. He saw his own crippling hesitation, his relentless self-doubt, laid bare in his daughter's tear-stained face. In that moment, he wasn't just seeing Lily's disappointment. He was seeing the invisible chains he'd forged for himself, now threatening to bind his children too. That night, sleep was a cruel joke. The house was utterly silent, save for the rhythmic rise and fall of Sarah's breathing beside him and the quiet creaks of an old home settling in for the night. But inside Clayton's head, it was a thunderous, relentless storm. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, every shadow morphing into the accusation in Lily's eyes. Why does our best never seem good enough? The words clawed at him, tearing away the comfortable lies he'd told himself for years. He'd always believed he was protecting his family by playing it safe, by avoiding risks, by being the reliable, quiet carpenter. But what had he really been doing? He'd been modeling fear. He'd been teaching his kids, without ever saying a word, that ambition was dangerous, that dreams were best left dreamt, that even your best effort might not be good enough, so why bother reaching too high? He rolled onto his side, punching his pillow in a silent fury. He thought of the hours he'd spent on that birdhouse, the care, the precision. He knew deep down it was a masterpiece compared to some glued-stick monstrosity. And yet it lost. Why? Because he had taught Lily that sometimes, even when you poured your heart into something, it still might not be enough. He had instilled in her, unconsciously, the same seed of doubt that had choked his own potential for decades. His life, laid out before him in the cruel honesty of 3 a.m., felt like a series of small retreats. Every time he'd backed down, every time he'd said, "No, that's too much." Every time he'd settled for less than he knew he was capable of, he hadn't just hurt himself. He hadn't just stifled his own spirit. He had, in his quiet, unassuming way, stolen a piece of his children's inherent confidence. He was supposed to be their rock, their example of courage, of what was possible. Instead, he was a living testament to quiet capitulation. A wave of nausea washed over him. His chest felt tight, an invisible hand squeezing his lungs. He was tired, bone-weary, not just from the day's work, but from the relentless internal battle, the constant questioning of his own worth. What had his life become? A carefully constructed cage of what-ifs and if-onlys built on the shifting sands of fear. He saw a future where Lily and Ethan, influenced by his subtle limitations, would also pull their punches, dim their own lights. And that vision, that bitter, heartbreaking vision, was far more terrifying than any failure he could ever face himself. He felt it then, a quiet snap deep inside him, like a dry twig breaking underfoot. It wasn't a roar, not a shout, just a hushed, utterly resolute thought. Enough. Not enough of the work, not enough of the struggle, but enough of this. Enough of letting fear carve out the path, enough of dimming his own light. Enough of passing that fear, like a cursed inheritance, down to his own kids. The cold, hard truth of his situation settled over him, not as a blanket of despair, but as a rigid steel plate of resolve. He didn't know what came next, didn't have a plan sketched out on a napkin or a grand speech rehearsed. All he knew, with a certainty that chilled him even more than the pre-dawn air, was that this way, his way, couldn't continue. The silent surrender, the cautious retreat, the constant belief that his best wasn't quite good enough, that had to end. He couldn't live with the man he was becoming, not if that man was going to teach his children to be afraid of their own potential. He got out of bed, the floorboards creaking under his weight like old bones. Sarah stirred but didn't wake. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, the silence of the house thick around him. The first rays of sun were just starting to bleed through the eastern sky, painting the edges of the horizon in bruised purples and faint oranges. A new day. For the first time in a long time, the thought of it didn't feel like another weight to carry. It felt like an invitation. The decision made, the how remained a daunting, shadowy question mark. But the why not had finally lost its power. Morning came, sharp and unsentimental, just like every other. Clayton went through the motions of breakfast with the kids, the clatter of spoons against bowls, the usual morning rush. He kissed Sarah goodbye, the scent of coffee and toast still clinging to her. Everything felt the same, and yet everything was different. The resolve he'd found in the pre-dawn quiet hummed beneath the surface, a low vibration in his chest. His first job of the day was routine. Replacing a few rotten deck boards for Mrs. Henderson, a sweet old lady who paid on time and rarely looked too closely. Easy money, predictable. The kind of work he usually clung to like a lifeline. He drove his old pickup, the tools clanking softly in the back, the familiar route passing under the tires. Then his phone buzzed. It was Marcus, an old contact from a commercial developer he'd done a few small jobs for years ago. Marcus was always in a hurry, always on the hunt for reliable guys, but also for creativity, for something a little extra. Clayton usually listened politely, then politely declined anything that sounded too complex, too demanding of his own design input. "Clayton, you busy?" Marcus's voice was a little static. "Why?" "Got a tricky one. Client S renovating an old downtown building, wants a custom reception desk. Not just a slab of wood, something with curves, built-in lighting, maybe even some reclaimed materials. High-end." My usual guy's swamped. "Thought of you." Clayton's grip tightened on the steering wheel. This was it. The old Clay would have already started rehearsing his polite refusal. "Too busy, Marcus. Maybe next time." Or, if he were to take it, he'd be mentally slashing his bid, convinced he couldn't deliver what they truly wanted, sure he'd mess it up. He imagined the plans, the intricate joinery, the hours of careful sanding and finishing, the client meetings, the risk of a mistake on such a visible piece. A tremor of his old fear, a familiar chill, snaked through him. His heart began to pound a little harder. This was exactly the kind of project he'd always steered clear of, the kind that whispered promises of creative fulfillment but screamed warnings of failure. Then he saw Lily's tear-streaked face in his mind's eye. "Addie, why does our best never seem good enough?" The memory cut through the fear like a saw through soft pine. It wasn't about whether he could do it. It was about whether he would even try. "Marcus," Clayton said, his voice a little rougher than usual. He cleared his throat. Send me the specs and some photos of the space. I'll put a design together. There was a beat of surprised silence on the other end. You serious? Never thought you'd go for something like this, Clay? Good. Send 'em over today. Need a proposal quick. Budget's decent, but they want unique. Unique, Clayton repeated, a strange taste in his mouth. It was a word he hadn't applied to his work in years. Understood. He hung up, his hands still clenching the phone. His palms were sweating. He could still hear the ghost of his old voice, the one that said, "You're not good enough for this. You'll mess it up." But for the first time, it was just a whisper, not a command. He still felt the nerves, raw and exposed, but something else was there too. A flicker, a small, stubborn ember of belief that he hadn't completely snuffed out. He got to Mrs. Henderson's, unloaded his tools, and started ripping out the rotten boards. But his mind wasn't on the simple task at hand. It was already sketching curves, visualizing reclaimed wood, seeing light spill from hidden ledges. His hands worked on autopilot, but his mind, for the first time in a long time, was truly alive, grappling with a challenge he had willingly accepted. It was hard. It was terrifying. But he was doing it. That night, after dinner and stories with the kids after Sarah was asleep, Clayton found himself hunched over the kitchen table. The silence of the house pressed in on him. Spread out before him weren't bills or school notices, but a stack of blank sheets and a few smudged pencils. Marcus had sent the photos and rough dimensions, a rustic-looking den with a big stone fireplace, begging for something custom, something warm. Clayton stared at the photos, the empty space mocking him. His mind, which had felt so alive earlier, now felt like a clogged drain. Every idea that surfaced was immediately drowned by a wave of apprehension. Too complicated, too simple, not practical. They won't like it. You don't know enough about modern design, Clay. Stick to what you know. The whispers were back, louder now, fueled by the vast, open-ended nature of the task. He sketched a simple bookshelf. Pathetic. He tried a floating media console. Everyone does that. He crumpled the paper, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Hours bled into each other. The coffee grew cold in his mug. The streetlights outside cast long, pale shadows through the window. He rubbed his temples, his eyes gritty with fatigue and frustration. This was what he'd avoided for so long, the uncertainty, the judgment, the raw exposure of putting his idea out there. His hands, usually so confident with a saw or a chisel, felt clumsy holding a pencil, trying to translate the vague vision in his head into something tangible. He missed the simple, methodical rhythm of replacing floorboards, where the steps were known, the outcome predictable. He finally managed to coax a few more coherent lines onto a sheet, a rough concept for a built-in unit with some subtle curves and integrated lighting. It wasn't genius, not by a long shot, but it was his. He stared at it, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. What if Marcus laughed? What if the client hated it? What if he just wasted precious hours he should have spent sleeping, only to confirm he was exactly what his inner critic claimed? The next morning, sleep-deprived but driven by a fragile sense of obligation, he scanned his sketches and emailed them to Marcus. He didn't include a long explanation, just a brief note. Initial concepts attached. Let me know thoughts. He hit send with a deep breath, like diving into cold water. Then he tried to push it from his mind, throwing himself into Mrs. Henderson's deck. He ripped, he cut, he nailed. The physical work was a balm, a temporary escape from the mental gymnastics. A few days later, the email arrived. Clayton saw Marcus's name in his inbox and felt his stomach lurch. He stared at it for a long minute, putting off the inevitable. He was in his truck, parked outside a hardware store, the engine still running. He took another deep breath, forced himself to open it. The tone was polite, professional, but the words hit him like a blunt hammer. Clay, appreciate you sending these over. Good starting point. However, a bit conservative for what they're looking for. The curves are a nice touch, but the overall feel is missing that wow factor, and that wood choice, while solid, isn't quite aligning with their aesthetic. They want bold, unique, something that makes a statement. Conservative, missing wow factor. Clayton felt the air drain out of his lungs. He closed his eyes, the words burning behind his eyelids. He knew it. He knew it all along. He'd tried to play it safe, even when trying to be bold, and he'd fallen flat. The old voice roared now, not a whisper, but a triumphant shout. See, I told you, you're not good enough. You don't have it. Just stick to decks and fences, Clayton. That's your ceiling. He sat there, gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. A familiar, suffocating wave of despair washed over him. This was it. This was the sign. He should just call Marcus, apologize, and tell him he couldn't do it. Go back to being the reliable, quiet carpenter who did what he was told, never venturing an opinion or an original thought. It felt like a warm, if slightly bitter, blanket of resignation. Safe, predictable, lifeless. Just then his phone buzzed in his lap. It was a text from Sarah. "Lily's telling me about her birdhouse. She says she wants to try again next year, but make it even better. She's got ideas." Clayton blinked, the words cutting through the haze of self-pity. "Lily, Daddy, why does our best never seem good enough?" Her face, streaked with tears, flashed in his mind. He remembered the fierce, protective surge he felt that day, the quiet promise he'd made to himself. This wasn't just about him anymore. His doubt, his playing small, it wasn't just affecting his own stifled dreams. It was echoing unknowingly into his kids' growing confidence, making them wonder if their best was enough. He looked back at Marcus's email, missing that wow factor. Bold, unique. He read it again, but this time something shifted. Instead of seeing condemnation, he saw feedback. Hard, honest feedback, not proof of his inadequacy, but a challenge. Marcus hadn't outright rejected him, he'd given him direction. A stubborn, unfamiliar heat began to spread in Clayton's chest. A resentment, not at Marcus or the client, but at that insidious voice in his own head. It had lied to him, kept him small, held him captive for years. He wasn't going to let it do that to his kids. He certainly wasn't going to let it do that to him anymore. He wasn't going to quit. Not after one setback, not after a dozen. He wasn't going to accept. Conservative. Pulled out his phone, opened a blank note, and started typing. "Marcus, thanks for the candid feedback. Understood. Give me another 48 hours. I'll resubmit something that makes a statement." He hit send. Then, instead of driving home or to another job, he drove to the biggest lumberyard in the next county, one he usually avoided because their prices were higher and their inventory overwhelming. Today, he wasn't looking for cheap pine. He was looking for something bold. Something unique. He wanted to see and feel the wood, let it speak to him, inspire him. He needed to get his hands on the materials that could truly make a statement, not just sketch them. He walked the aisles, touching exotic hardwoods, running his fingers over grains he'd only ever seen in magazines. The sense of cedar, oak, and something sweet and unfamiliar filled his lungs. Ideas began to bubble up, not timidly, but with a quiet insistence. He wasn't just looking at wood anymore. He was seeing possibilities. He was seeing his design, bold and unique, taking shape. The fear was still there, a dull ache in his gut, but it was overshadowed by a rising tide of stubborn, desperate determination. He wasn't just trying to win a job. He was fighting for something much bigger. He was fighting for belief in himself, in what his hands could create, for his kids. He spent the next 2 days in a blur. The bold design he submitted wasn't just a drawing. It was a promise he made to himself. He picked out a deep, rich walnut and a lighter, contrasting maple, picturing the way they'd interlock. The first cut was always the hardest, the point of no return. But this time, as the saw bit into the expensive timber, there wasn't that familiar knot of dread. Instead, a focus, sharp and clean, settled over him. It was a new feeling, like stepping onto a path he'd always avoided, realizing the ground was solid beneath his feet. Marcus, the client, called him back 3 days later. "Clayton," his voice boomed, "I wasn't expecting this. This is different. You know what? I like different. It's got guts. When can you start?" Clayton just nodded, a small, tight smile spreading across his face. He didn't jump or shout. The victory felt quiet, internal. It was less about winning the job and more about showing up. The project was a custom-built reception desk for a high-end office, elaborate and demanding, requiring joinery techniques he hadn't used since trade school. Every evening he'd come home bone-tired, but his mind wasn't buzzing with worries about mistakes. It was alive with solutions, with new angles, with the satisfaction of a challenging day's work. Sarah noticed it first. He'd actually tell her about his day, not just grunt. He'd talk about the tricky dovetails, the way the light caught the grain, the problem he'd solved. He wasn't just a carpenter building a desk. He was an artist crafting a vision. One Saturday morning, Lily came into his workshop, the smell of sawdust a familiar comfort to her. She watched him painstakingly sand a complex curve. "Daddy," she asked, her voice small, "are you still sad about my birdhouse?" He stopped, looked at her, and truly saw her. Not just his daughter, but a reflection of that fear he'd lived with for so long. He knelt down, wiping a fleck of sawdust from her cheek. "No, sweet pea," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Your birdhouse was beautiful, and it taught me something important. Sometimes the best doesn't always win the prize, but that doesn't mean it isn't good. It just means some folks don't see it yet. Or maybe you gotta believe in it enough for everyone." He tapped his chest. "Right here." He got the birdhouse from a shelf, the one that had lost. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands. It was good, solid, thoughtful. He'd helped her, but he'd also held back, subtly guiding her towards safe. choices, making sure it was perfect in his own anxious way instead of letting her imagination truly soar. He looked at Lily. Tell you what, let's build another one. No rules, just whatever you think a bird would really love. Something nobody has ever seen before. Her eyes widened, a spark rekindled. He saw it in her and he recognized it in himself. Days bled into weeks and weeks into months. The reception desk was finished, delivered, and admired. Marcus called to offer him another, even more ambitious job. Clayton quoted his price, fairly, confidently, explaining the value of his craftsmanship, and didn't flinch when Marcus agreed. He wasn't just working anymore. He was building a reputation, piece by painstaking piece, a legacy he'd only dared to dream of before. His workshop, once a place of quiet, almost stifling routine, became a hub of creative energy. He started taking on custom furniture commissions, intricate designs he'd sketched out years ago and then tucked away, dismissing them as too risky, too ambitious. Each piece was a step further away from the man who used to underbid, who used to play it safe. He still felt the familiar flutter of nerves when starting something new, when facing a tricky cut or an unfamiliar challenge. But now, it wasn't a paralyzing fear. It was more like a jolt of electricity, a sign that he was alive, that he was pushing his boundaries, growing. That little voice of doubt, the one that used to scream, was now just a whisper, easily silenced by the roar of the saw, the rhythm of the hammer, the quiet satisfaction of a perfect joint. Sarah saw him laugh more, truly laugh, not just the polite chuckle he'd managed before. He'd play more actively with Ethan and Lily, building elaborate forts in the backyard or sketching fantastical treehouses for them. His shoulders, which had always carried the quiet weight of worry, seemed a little straighter, his steps a little lighter. He wasn't a different man entirely. He was still Clayton, the quiet carpenter with capable hands. But the quietness was no longer an armor against his own inadequacy. It was the calm confidence of a man who knew his worth. He remembered the lesson, clear as day, that conversation with Lily at his workbench. Turns out, he once mused to Sarah, watching the kids play in the yard, the biggest thing holding me back wasn't the work itself or the tools or even what folks thought about me. It was just me telling myself I couldn't. It was that voice inside, whispering doubts and fears. Once I finally learned to shut that voice up and just got to work, truly got to work, things started to click. He paused, a faraway look in his eyes. You gotta believe in your own two hands, your own head. Nobody else is gonna do that for you. Not really, not when it counts. And that was Clayton. Not a man who suddenly became loud or boisterous, but a man who found his own quiet roar. He learned that confidence wasn't about knowing you'd never fall. It was about knowing you could always pick yourself back up, and that the only true failure was never trying at all. He built homes, he built furniture, and in the process he rebuilt himself. He understood, finally, that his greatest creation wasn't something made of wood and nails. It was the unwavering belief he carved out of his own spirit. Some men spend their lives building empires. Others build families or legacies or stories. But the truest architects, the ones who leave something lasting, are often the quiet